You guys aren't going to believe this, but durable learning is hitting the mainstream, whether it's because of what we've put out there and people are responding to it, or it's just because the science works. I tend to think it's more the latter. It's really exciting to see durable learning messaging getting phased in all over the place. We're going to dissect one of those in a very popular podcast on this episode of the Learning Geeks podcast, starting now. Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, Bob.
Happy day.
Happy day.
Happy day.
Third episode of season 7, unless we decide to shift up the release order after all, but we think this will be the third episode of season 7.
Yeah, that's the first time I think we've ever said that because we never get it right.
I know. Well, that's why I just threw out so many caveats.
We strategize, and then we forget what we strategized on, and then editing gets wonky. And
my favorite thing is when we talk about an episode that just came out of some show, and it's like a month and a half later. Let's not spoil it. Well, the season's been done for a month, so that's okay.
I know.
That's my fault usually, but
that's okay.
It out.
That's okay. Well, I know this will get released before Star Wars Skeleton Crew comes out because that's going to be beginning of December. So looking forward to that.
Yep.
There's been some tumult in the Star Wars land, which I invite everybody to come over to the Star Wars Cleaning Crew and listen to.
Okay, I'm behind, so I have to get
I thought the article you forwarded, Bob, was very interesting about, has Disney been have they done Star Wars justice?
Yeah, is Disney really bad at Star Wars? Yeah, from the Hollywood Reporter. In fact, yes, I'm going to record an episode of Star Wars Cleaning Crew about that specific thing. So about that article.
You should do it underneath the Hollywood sign. It would just have a little more
more oomph. I am the Hollywood Reporter.
Yes.
Yeah. But meanwhile, let's talk about learning. So here's kind of the origin of this episode. I know it will come as a shock to you guys, but there are actually other podcasts that get more listeners than we do. We do pretty good, but there are some podcasts that are more popular than ours.
8 is definitely more than 7. So
true. Right. So, one of those podcasts is Andrew Huberman, who is a professor at Stanford. And a few weeks ago, our dear friend Lauren Hodges sent us all a link to an episode of Andrew Huberman's podcast all about the optimal ways of studying and learning. And we gave it a listen.
And it was great.
Great. And one of the things, as I implied in the cold open, I was really excited about was the fact that I really felt everything that he was saying was aligned with the durable learning practices. So, I forwarded this on to my son's girlfriend, who is in med school right now and looking for tips on how to study. Sent this to her and said, this podcast is 100% Learning Geeks approved. So I thought that we could kind of go in, take a look at what Huberman said. Like I said, most of it was aligned with what we say. There were some things in there that were a little surprising. There was one thing that was kind of in conflict to what I've always thought, and we can talk about that. So we have plenty of time to dive into all that, but let me start. And any other reactions to listening to it, and any good stories like you forwarded?
No, I agree. I started listening to it and immediately thought, well, this is so in line with our durable learning principles as well as the learn to learn stuff that we've taught. In your cold open, you said, others are adapting it. I think it's been out there. I think others are discovering it.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yep.
And it's great. And whatever role we've played in that, yay.
Yeah.
But there are others who are also playing a role in surfacing this stuff. It's great. It's good, and it works.
Yeah.
My reaction was it made me feel, because he made reference that a lot of the things in there was new to him, or it surprised him. And so it made me think of 2014, 2015, Dana. I can't remember when that was, we started with the research.
Yeah.
Well, it was mainly you, but mainly as we kind of started sharing it out. It was a lot what I experienced, even though from all of the learning design background that I've had, even from that, there were still some things that it popped for me where I could relate it to how I personally have experienced my own learning and development. And you can relate it to that, as well as there's some things that I had to start to do when we talk, I'm sure, about a couple things like neuroplasticity and other things that I personally had to do as I went forward to learn about learning. And that was a big kind of aha for me. So it just made me feel like what I went through during that time.
So let's talk about neuroplasticity, because he does address neuroplasticity in his podcast. And one of the things that I don't know if it was new to me. It kind of struck me as new just from the way he was phrasing it. He was talking about how most of neuroplasticity is the selective forgetting of things, right? What was your guys' reaction to that?
I thought he was right.
Well,
there's
go ahead, Dan.
I don't know if these are, if it's in my head, if it's a movie that I saw one time, but it's about the person that didn't forget anything and had everything ever present. And that's a freaky idea to think that, if everything you ever experienced and everything you ever saw and smelled and tasted was ever present, I think your brain would have to blow up.
There are two interesting things with that. Two famous people. So Marilu Henner, the actor who was on Taxi back when we were kids, she has a memory that she doesn't forget anything. You can basically go back to her and say, give her a date of some time in her life, and she can tell you, she can replay that entire day for you.
Sean McVay of the coach for the
that was
LA
my second
Rams
one.
is the same thing. Yeah.
It's the same thing. You can ask him about any football play in any game, and he can remember exactly what it is.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
But very
rare. There are things we want to forget, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are things we want to forget, and sometimes we can't, if they're really impactful. But that's part of what he talks about, and what the research says is that when you sleep, and I know we're going to talk perhaps a little bit about that, your brain does a lot of that processing. It says, this is important, this is not important. Let's get rid of this, let's retain this, and let's connect this to this. We for years, researchers thought that sleep was just a time when everything kind of chilled.
Yeah.
But it turns out that your brain is at times more active while you're sleeping than it is when you're awake. And it's because of it's actively forgetting and making connections for the things that it doesn't feel like it should forget.
And Dana, do you know, even more specifically, is it during the REM sleep that happens? Okay, yeah, because I saw another video as I was poking around on this where a woman was saying, it was during the dreaming. It was during the REM's time.
That's why when you get into sleep science, they talk about the importance of getting into specific habits in which you can get into that deep sleep, or get into that certain sleep, right? Levels. And again, I'm not an expert of that sleep science at all. This is where our friend Lauren Hodges needs to come on and share that. But I've
become an expert at afternoon naps since I've retired.
Do you dream during those naps, and then do you wake up and know more?
So Bob, you're going to laugh. I had and you know how weird the mind is, but I had a dream the other day that I am not doing this, but I had a dream that I was interviewing for a position at a company that did measurement. And I was sitting there, this person was asking me, and in my head I'm thinking, I don't want a job. And so she said, well, I'd like to offer you the job. I said, no, I'm not interested. And then Tad Waddington walked by.
Tad.
And Tad said, Dana, come on, I want you to work with me. Anyways, Tad is someone that Bob and I worked with a long time ago. We love Tad.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's weird how your mind works, and it pulls things from, I don't know where it pulls them from, but it starts making these connections. And I think that dream and a lot of our other dreams might be kind of remnants of the cycling that takes place as your brain is trying to make sense out of everything you're experiencing.
Yeah. Well, I know too, for myself, to be a little vulnerable here, is I used to have a steel trap memory. And I've noticed in recent times, like my short-term and long-term, my long-term memory is still pretty good. My short-term memory, definitely not what it was. And also, I've been having sleeping problems really for about the last 20 years or so. And I just wonder, how much of that is just me naturally getting older, and how much is it because of the sleep problems that I have, that my short-term memory isn't quite as good?
Yeah.
It is just pretty amazing with the power of sleep. And Bob, I don't know if you saw my email when we were talking about this pre-show, and you did a synthesis with Google's notebook, right? Of this, and I thought it was really, really accurate. And I was kind of surprised they didn't pull out sleep, because there was like a 10-minute stretch in there where I felt like I was listening to an infomercial on the importance of sleep. But at the same time, he's done a ton of work into it, so he's got a ton of episodes into it, so it made sense. But going back to neuroplasticity, like if the three things that he did mention was the act that it could strengthen existing neural connections, it can weaken existing neural connections, and then neurogenesis, so the addition of new neurons. And what I did kind of walk away from, even though I knew it, but I also don't think, if we're thinking about my own existing neurons and synapses and so forth, I don't think it was as strong as what others are. But in more common in media and other things, you might hear more of building new neurons, because I think you hear that story of, however, it doesn't matter how old you are, you could still learn, you could still develop, and you could still create new neurons. But it's actually more of a rare, one of the more less common things.
Right.
And you hear more about strengthening and weakening. And that's where I feel that I have done more of the focus, even for me personally, is that there are times where, how do I weaken existing connections? Like, how do I take something that I used to think really strongly, and then now I have to learn something different that goes against what I existingly had before.
Jake, what I liked is he used that kind of as a setup for talking about optimal study habits, right? It's because the theory is the strengthening and the weakening. I mean, it's science, but I mean that's the theory that he's applying. And so to me, that was the real payoff. Is here's the foundation. Now I'm going to explain how you can strengthen and how you can weaken through a variety of science-based study habits. And maybe we should talk about those.
Yeah. Let's move on to that. But I do want to just make a quick aside, because Jake kind of dropped this in here just in terms of timeliness, is Notebook LM, which is a tool built into Google. You can access it with notebooklm.google.com. I recommend that every learning person go out there and play with this a little bit, because it's really pretty cool. I learned about it in January, and I thought, yeah, it's okay. I didn't quite start using it, but they've just made some upgrades, and it's really, really cool now. And by the way, one of the things that it will do is, when you pull together a whole bunch of sources to create a notebook, one of the things that you can generate is about a 10 to 15 minute podcast generated by two AI voices, a man and a woman, talking about whatever it is that you want it to talk about that you've pulled together from all these sources. So watch your backs, fellow podcasters, but it's a pretty cool thing. So, but yes, let's talk about some of those study habits. And the one that I was most excited to see him really major on and focus on was testing, right? Because we've been saying that for years. We know how effective testing and recall practice is actually as a learning activity, not just to confirm what you know, not just as an assessment, but as a learning activity itself. So it was great hearing him talk about that.
Years ago, when I was at one of the many universities I studied at, I took a study skills class, and one of the things they said was, when you're taking notes in class, use this. And it was a particular type of note paper where 2/3 was where you took your notes, and then 1/3 was left open. And so I took my notes, and then that 1/3 you were used to create questions about the content that you took notes on. And then, so you're going through the process of synthesizing the content and saying, okay, what question does this answer? And then when you go to study, you cover up the content and you just focus on answering the questions. And I thought that was a really interesting way to self-study, because you not only had the questions, but you had to create the questions from the content and kind of solidify your understanding that way. So, so I've been a fan of that for years.
Yeah. You know, one thing that did come up to me, Bob, outside of this, and there was an interesting study. So again, if you listeners are going to go back and listen to it, do check the study that he references in it. But it did make me think that in many cases as we're learning, because again, I think he's talking specifically about studying. I think even though in general he kicks it off with you as individual learners who are studying, I think he's kind of targeting more to students, but at the same time, he says, even if you're not, so forth. But again, a lot of the academic research is done on in kind of a formal educational environment. But one of the questions I do think about when I think of studying in our context, or testing, sorry, how do you always get to test when you may not have access to, maybe it's not all basic information that you're learning? Or, how do you test more frequently? I guess I'll throw them out to you too. When we don't always just have access to creating time to put together some flip charts or, your cards or flip cards or putting together a quiz for yourself. I'm just curious, for in our context, what would some of those examples be like?
Well, I think as Dana was saying, just creating the questions on your own based on the material that you have is an effective part of the process as well, right? So am I hearing you right on that, Jake? Like, I think that we as the learning team might not be able to generate texts quite as well as somebody doing it on their own, and that would be even more effective perhaps. The thing I think about, though, is you've got to have a pretty highly motivated learner in order to go through with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need somebody who is determined to want to learn that thing. So again, I'm going to sound like an ad for Google, which I'm not, but that's also one of the features of this new notebook LM, right? Is it'll generate a study guide for you that generates both like open-ended short form questions and essay questions, not multiple choice. And I think that that's really rich. So, like I think a mildly moderated, mildly motivated learner would be more likely to do something like that and still get a lot of benefit out of it than to generate on their own.
Mm-hmm. Dana, any other ideas?
Well, I was just thinking about, in order to do this, what we're saying is that the learner really needs to engage.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the whole idea of passive learning just is not effective at all. And there's a variety of ways that they can engage. They can engage by creating their own test or by using the tool that Bob was just talking about. I think one of the things that he pointed out that I think we've all experienced is, if you are a student, I guess it could be in the training environment too, you get out of that training situation and immediately you're bombarded with, you're late on this assignment, or this project is due, or you got phone calls or email you need to respond to. You don't really you don't take the time to step back and just say, okay, what did I just learn? What questions do I still have about what I learned?
Right.
What do I already know that I can connect with what I learned? And that very conscientious effort to learn is so critical in the whole process of learning.
Yeah. When I go through, I know I've shared this multiple times, but when I read books specifically for something that I'm trying to get better at, I might read like one or two at a time, but it takes me forever. Because most of the time what I do is I read a couple of chapters in and I do a lot of reflection and thinking about how to apply it. And there's one, I'm staring at it right now, but there's a book that I'm on right now where I'm pretty far into it. And I take a ton of notes, really from the context of how I think I might apply what I'm learning from it. And then there's moments that I'm not using it as a reference and I'm trying to recall what I read in that book.
Mm-hmm.
And then I go back to go see, did I get it right? So that is a form of test. So it's a bit of am I capturing the right terminology in which I learned from that book? Am I getting the right structure in which this new framework that I may have learned from that book? So I use the book as like my answer guide, because it's not like, Bob, to your example, which I think that's what GPTs are fantastic at, is being able to generate factual information. If you give it the right information, it can be used as like a test guide. But in that case, I don't have the copy to the digital book, so I have to just use that as my reference book for it.
Yeah. One of the studies that he talked about around testing, which I thought was fascinating. And I might get the details of this a little bit wrong. So, save your cards and letters if I do, or send them, because we'd love to hear from you. um, but he basically said, they did an experiment where they took one group, they exposed them to some content, then they had 3 study sessions, and then they had a final test. Yeah. And then they had a group where they did 2 study sessions and a practice test before the final test. Every configuration down to exposure to the content, 3 practice tests, and then the final test. And it was that group that only did the testing in the intermediary that performed best on the final test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they were exposed more towards failing than probably the others, right? So you only studied one session, had one study session, then more frequent tests. So then the act of testing, getting the feedback loop integrated within it, and now you could see what am I getting right and getting wrong. But that in itself is a moment of failure. It's a moment of when there might be some emotional connection there from like whether or not you were disappointed in yourself, but again, how do I get better at it? It's like all these little micro things that do occur, but you're doing it more, you're getting more and more chances to practice on it and make yourself recall. And then the question I didn't know, I have to look back at the studies that he referenced, but I don't know how long it was until the final test. So they did the multiple iterations and then a final test. I know he said that sometimes they go, it was mixed duration, but it is very fascinating. Then again, multiple practice tests.
Yeah.
And so I saw Dana looking at his book collection back
there. Yeah, I think this is the book. It's called Teach Students How to Learn. I think this is the one where I was introduced to the term retrieval practice, right? Where instead of the teachers went in and told the students the first day, they said, hey, when we put something in front of you that has a whole bunch of questions on it, it's not a test or a quiz, you're practicing retrieving the content. So we're not going to have a quiz today, we're going to have some retrieval practice.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is when we say test or quiz, sometimes you get stressed, right? But if you think of it as just a natural part of learning, then that's, I think, where it's most helpful, because you don't have that stress element in there. So when we're talking about self-testing, what we're really talking about is retrieval practice, which ties back to one of the modes of neuroplasticity, which is the strengthening of existing connections or creating new ones.
Yeah. So that book was Teach Students How to Learn by Saundra, Yancy, McGuire. I had to pull that up, but I have the digital copy that I do remember. And that was
I think that's where they introduced that term. And it's a good book to read, even if that's not. Yeah. Even if I'm giving them credit for something that's not in there. It was a while ago when I read it.
Yep.
Yeah.
I like it.
I will have to pick that up. And all of this means that to really make it work, you have to have a growth mindset, right? As opposed to a fixed mindset. To go back to Carol Dweck's work, I think everybody's pretty familiar with that. That is, I think, even a little more challenging in a corporate learning environment. You really have to build a culture of learning in that way. And you have to have people be comfortable with the idea that if I'm using intermediary testing as a learning technique, that I'm not being measured and evaluated on that, and career decisions are being made on those intermediary tests, because then I think that will really mess up the learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
you got to make sure people believe that, and you've got to make sure it's true too.
Yeah. And kind of piggybacking off that, one of the things that I liked the most that he called out, and I'm glad he did, was a technique on teach backs. So teaching back what you're learning.
Yeah.
So even if you're in the process of whatever stage you are, teaching back. And, there's multiple things occurring there. So one of it's a generative process that you are now kind of taking all what you're learning and you're synthesizing it and then articulating out, which is a really effective thing. And then if you're doing that with, let's say, more of an expert in that topic, you can then use it for, you're using it as a feedback loop. Because if you're teaching more of a novice, they're not going to be able to give you necessarily feedback because, again, they haven't developed that information yet. But the process of doing that is going to help strengthen your own understanding of the content or the topic and the knowledge. But again, going back to the practice technique, that's one of the ways that I use it. I like to teach back to, or I'm sorry, I like to use that strategy to even someone that is more of an expert, because then I can get that feedback cues from it to find out, like, am I aligned? That's like it's another testing mechanism. But I would say we started this podcast kind of for the same reason, to teach back what we're learning as we go through it. It's a generative process. That's one of my favorites. I'm glad he mentioned that one.
I started this podcast for fame and profit, so I don't know what you were talking about, Jake.
Well, my name's not Fame and Jake's name's not Profit, so I guess you got the wrong co-hosts.
Got the wrong goal. I think Jake has achieved his goal, but faster than I have achieved my goal. But
well, a fame,
infamy, perhaps. Profit, definitely not.
No profit, nothing.
Our net income on the Learning Geeks podcast is a red number, but
yeah, it's a total negative number. Yeah.
We do it because we love it.
We do. We love talking to all of you. Hey, before we close, because we are drawing to a close here.
Yeah.
One specific tip he gave that I felt was in conflict with our durable learning principles was, he said you should study alone. And we have the principle of social learning. So I kind of have an idea about what he was talking about there, but I was wondering, did you guys react the same way? And what was your reflection on that?
I did react the same way, because the research I've read indicates that there's a lot of value in social learning. And then I, compare and contrast that with his example about teaching back. Right? He was talking about in a medical environment, if you teach, some because it's competitive, sometimes people are saying, hey, I don't want to teach, my colleagues, because then they're going to get ahead of me. It turns out the person who does the teaching understands the material much more effectively. So to me, that's a social setting. That's a social context.
Yes.
And now there are different ways of looking at it. There's also cohort-based learning, right, which we know is effective. So I think I took it, that part, with a grain of salt, saying, in my head, he didn't have enough time to elaborate, or he hasn't been exposed to some of that other literature.
Yeah, I thought it was very contextual. Like there's a lot of context involved in that one. So very similar to Dana, where again he's speaking a lot in a study term, the study part of it. And what I think studying alone does really well is it. And I'm using the term studying, but just anytime you are learning, you are capable. It's easier for you to set the environment in which is more effective for you to learn. So anytime you add any other variable, such as another individual, you add now the risk of more distractions to occur, to go off of topic. Now I'm getting a thumbs up on my computer there for the thing. And my computer apparently agrees with that, which is another reason why I get distracted, is these computers. So
squirrel.
Yeah, exactly. So that
what were we talking about, Jake?
There you go. That's exactly the reason. So I think from a context standpoint, that is one of the biggest reasons of why I think it is effective. And from the research it showed, it allows you to control the environment, which is incredibly important in it. But from a social dynamic, teaching back is a social dynamic. When you do other types of generative processes, you want to have the social end of it, because now you're starting to hear from how other peers, in comparisons, you're getting more and more feedback loops and mechanisms. And that's where, again, I think it was very contextual from that statement.
I agree with that completely.
And you don't just stand up and start teaching. You need to have that alone focus time beforehand to prepare, right? So I think, social learning isolated is going to be much less value than if there is some type of preparation coming into it. So you can defend, you can debate. But to me, there's so much value in taking concepts that are out there. I mean, words are really ineffective. The words we have are really an ineffective way of communicating. I mean, take a look at a picture of the Fall Mountains in Utah, and try to describe that with words. It's really ineffective. But when we take concepts and we try to explain them to others, that's, as you pointed out, Jake, that's a very generative process. And that, what does it mean to be a generative process? It means that you are strengthening existing connections, and you're weakening your other ones, and you're creating new ones. So it's just, to me, social is an important part.
Yeah.
And we're doing social right now.
We are.
Between
Exactly.
the three of us.
We are. Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, with his comments on studying alone, for me, it is, if you're part of a group that is focused on collaboratively learning and working on learning basically the same content, we should keep doing it. If you're joining a group, and I'm thinking like college study sessions where you're sitting in a coffee shop with 8 other people and none of you are studying the same thing and you're distracting each other, then that's probably really more what he was talking about. So
I agree.
Yeah.
Again, a lot of it
Great.
is educational based environments,
Yeah.
situations
Yeah.
that you go through. And lastly, I'd say the last thing on it, of when you do learn with others, also think about, I think about that feedback loop. So how,
Yeah.
if you're learning from others who are also all novices, where's your feedback
Yeah.
coming from to allow you
What's
to
the
ensure
source
that
of
you
truth?
are, where's your source of truth?
So you're not all stupid together, is what you're trying to say.
Exactly.
So
The
learn
blind
from
leading the
us, the
blind.
three of us here. We've had many of those opportunities where we've learned from.
Don't be stupid
Don't be
together.
stupid
Yeah.
together. But that's
sure.
that's
I'm
another.
going to get a T-shirt that says "Don't be stupid together."
I was stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
I am stupid, and I'm with stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But on the whole, Huberman's podcast was great. Again,
It's great. Yep.
you know, he's pointing people in the directions that we've been talking about. So that's just goodness. And, you know, if there's anything that he disagrees with, he is more than welcome to join us on the Learning Geeks podcast and discuss it at any point. We would love to have him on. If any
Or
of
he
y'all
could
know
share.
the dude,
He can just reference the name on his podcast, which, going back to the beginning of the show, he's a much bigger, popular podcast than we are.
Exactly. That would be good. That'd be good. Guys,
I just one thing. You know, we've talked about a lot of concepts that he had in there, and we just kind of pick and chose. We chose them anyway, random ideas. I think the way he lays it out in his podcast is much more systematic, and I'd highly recommend people listen to the main podcast.
We'll put it in the show notes. We'll put the
Wonderful.
reference. Good. Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Well, guys, as always, it's been great.
Yeah.
Super fun when we just chat about stuff.
It is. Have a great week, gentlemen.
Yeah. Have a great week, listeners. We're glad that you're here. Make sure that you stay tuned. Make sure that you like and comment and subscribe and tell all your friends and all of that good stuff. We'll see you on the next episode of the Learning Geeks podcast, coming at some point really soon, probably in a couple weeks. Until then, take care. Keep learning. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.